Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving deep into the world where philosophy and Christian theology kind of collide.
Huh?
You sent us some really interesting material from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it looks like you're ready to go way beyond just the surface level stuff. You want the really nitty-gritty philosophical details of how these two disciplines interact, right?
Absolutely. It's a common misconception that philosophy and Christian theology are at odds, but the truth is they have this really long and tangled history. They've been constantly shaping and challenging one another.
So it's not just a simple yay or nay when it comes to philosophy's role in Christian thought.
No, not at all. The encyclopedia article actually lays out four main models for how they relate. They call them integration, cooperation, disjunction, and conflict. It's kind of like a spectrum of possibilities.
All right, let's unpack these models then. First up, integration. What's the gist?
Imagine the early church fathers, like Augustine, right? They're grappling with their faith using the tools of ancient Greek philosophy. They didn't see a hard line between the two. For them, it was all part of the same quest for truth.
So for them, faith and reason were basically two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. They saw philosophy as a way to understand and explain the mysteries of their faith. It was about finding harmony between revealed truths and human reason.
Got it. So then we have cooperation. Is that where that famous phrase ancilla theologiae comes in?
You got it. That's Latin for handmaid of theology, and it perfectly captures this whole model. Think of Aquinas, right? The philosophical heavyweight. He argued that philosophy could be super helpful for theology, clarifying concepts, refining arguments, all that. But he said it couldn't actually prove those core theological truths. That's the realm of revelation.
So philosophy is playing a supporting role, kind of like a trusty sidekick, right?
A very good analogy. It helps theology do its job better, but it doesn't steal the show.
Makes sense. Then we move further down the spectrum to disjunction. Sounds like things are starting to drift apart a little.
Think about reformers like Luther and Calvin. They were really wary of philosophy's influence on theology, felt that reason on its own couldn't really grasp the depths of God's truth. They saw philosophy and theology as operating in separate spheres, different starting points, different goals.
So not enemies exactly, but definitely not collaborating either. More like ships passing in the night.
That's a good way to put it. And finally, we come to conflict. The big showdown. Faith versus reason.
Yeah, this is the one that gets all the headlines, right? The classic battle between science and religion, but with philosophy in the mix.
Right. But even the most vocal critics of philosophy and Christian history didn't completely reject reason. Take Tertullian, for example. He famously asked, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" But he wasn't saying reason was useless. He was more saying, recognizing its limits when it comes to understanding those divine mysteries.
So even in the conflict model, there's still some nuance there. It's not a total rejection of reason.
Precisely. It's more about recognizing that faith and reason have their own domains, and yeah, sometimes they clash.
Okay, so we've got these different models for how philosophy and theology can relate, but how does this actually play out when we look at specific Christian doctrines? Let's start with the big one, the Trinity. 3 persons, 1 God. I'm already feeling a philosophical headache coming on.
Yeah, it's a concept that has puzzled philosophers for centuries. The logical problem of the Trinity, how to reconcile the threeness and the oneness of God. It's like a major philosophical battleground. There are so many different approaches. You've got your social Trinitarians, your Latin Trinitarians, your relative identity theories, your constitution theories. It's a real intellectual labyrinth.
Whoa, okay, let's break it down a bit. You mentioned social Trinitarians. What's their take on this divine puzzle?
Thinkers like Richard Swinburne and William Lane Craig, they're key figures in this camp. They argue that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are 3 distinct centers of consciousness, like 3 individuals, each with their own unique thoughts and will.
Okay, so they are distinct in that sense. But how do social Trinitarians square that with the idea of one God?
They argue that these 3 persons are so perfectly united in love and purpose that they constitute a single God. Imagine a family, incredibly close-knit. Each member has their own personality, their own way of seeing the world, right? Yet they're bound together by such deep love and a shared purpose that they act as one unit. That's the kind of unity social Trinitarians see in God.
So it's unity through relationship, kind of perfect harmony of wills.
That's the essence of it.
Fascinating. But then we have the Latin Trinitarians, right? They have a different spin on things.
Yeah, they do. Brian Leftow is a prominent voice in this camp. Latin Trinitarians argue that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, while they're distinct persons, they're not distinct agents. They share a single will and act as one.
Wait, hold on. If they don't have separate wills or actions, how can they be truly distinct persons? That sounds like a contradiction.
It's definitely a head scratcher. Lefto uses this rather mind-bending analogy to explain it. He compares the Trinity to a time-traveling chorus line dancer. Imagine a single dancer, right, performing a routine, but at different points in time. Each temporal slice of the dancer is distinct. They're at a different point in the routine, yet they're all part of the same dancer.
Okay, I'm going to need a minute to wrap my head around that one. So it's like each person of the Trinity is a different expression of the same divine essence.
You would think of it that way, yeah. But as you can imagine, both the social and the Latin Trinitarian views have their own strengths and
Yeah.
weaknesses.
It sounds like trying to solve a philosophical puzzle with multiple sets of pieces.
Exactly. And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the philosophical challenges of the Trinity.
All right, so we've been wrestling with some pretty heavy concepts. The Trinity, the incarnation, divine and human natures. It's a lot to process, but this deep dive wouldn't be complete if we didn't tackle another central pillar of Christian theology, right? Atonement and salvation.
You're right about that. And just like with the Trinity and the Incarnation, there's like this whole landscape of philosophical thought, surrounding these concepts.
So atonement is the idea that Christ saves us
Yeah.
from something, right?
But the source material points out that there's no single universally accepted answer to how that actually works.
That's right. Throughout Christian history, all these different models of atonement have emerged. Each one comes with its own set of philosophical questions and challenges. Some of the most prominent ones are like satisfaction theories and penal substitution theories.
Okay, let's start with satisfaction theories. What's the core idea there?
Think back to Anselm of Canterbury, way back in the 11th century. He argued that sin creates this debt that humans owe to God. We've essentially wronged God, and justice demands some kind of reparation. So it's like a cosmic courtroom drama, right? We've broken the law, and now we got to pay the price.
That's a good way to visualize it. The problem is, according to Anselm, this debt is so huge we could never repay it on our own. We're just not capable of making things right with God through our own efforts.
So we're stuck in this cosmic debtor's prison.
That's where Christ steps in. Through his perfect life, death, and resurrection, he makes satisfaction to God on our behalf. It's as if he pays off our debt in full.
Wow, that's a powerful image. But it raises a lot of questions, too. For instance, why would God even need satisfaction in the first place?
Yeah.
Why couldn't God just forgive us out of sheer mercy? Wouldn't that be more in line with the image of a loving God?
That's one of the main philosophical objections to satisfaction theories. Critics, like the 19th century theologian Adolf von Harnack, argued that this model makes God seem vengeful, demanding payment for a wrong. It doesn't quite fit with the idea of a God whose very nature is love and forgiveness.
So some might see it as a kind of divine quid pro quo, mercy for a price.
Exactly. And that leads us to penal substitution theories, which share some similarities with satisfaction theories, but with a different emphasis.
Okay, so how do penal substitution theories approach atonement?
Instead of focusing on, debt, these theories emphasize punishment. They maintain that sin, by its very nature, deserves punishment from a just God.
So there's a strong emphasis on divine justice in this model.
Absolutely. But instead of punishing us directly, Christ takes that punishment upon himself. He becomes our substitute, suffering the penalty we deserve. It's like a legal transaction where guilt is transferred and punishment is meted out, but Christ steps in to absorb the blow.
So in a sense, Christ becomes a kind of cosmic scapegoat bearing the burden of our sin. That's a pretty intense image.
It is, and it raises some of the same philosophical objections as satisfaction theories. Like, if God is truly loving and merciful, why would he require punishment at all? And is it truly just to punish an innocent person in place of the guilty? These are questions that have wrestled theologians and philosophers for centuries.
Yeah. It sounds like both satisfaction and penal substitution theories are trying to grapple with this tension between God's justice and God's mercy. But they're doing it in ways that raise some serious philosophical red flags. Are there any alternative views of atonement that try to navigate these issues differently?
There are. One contemporary approach that stands out is offered by the philosopher Eleanor Stump. She's quite critical of those traditional satisfaction and penal substitution theories. She argues they don't fully address the inner state of the sinner.
That's interesting. So it's not just about like a legal transaction or a transfer of guilt. It's about what's happening inside the person who's seeking atonement.
Exactly. Stump focuses on the sinner's experience of shame, alienation from God, the need for inner healing. She develops what she calls a Marian interpretation of atonement. She draws on some really interesting ideas from second person psychology.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the Marian interpretation all about, and what does second-person psychology have to do with it?
We'll think about the way we relate to other people, how we understand their thoughts and feelings and intentions. Second person psychology explores these interpersonal dynamics, focusing on things like empathy, shared attention, what's often called mind reading. Stump applies these insights to our relationship with God, specifically through Christ.
So it's not just about God acting upon us, it's about a deeper level of connection and understanding between God and humanity.
That's a key part of it, yeah. Stump argues that through his suffering, Christ comes to know and experience the depths of human sinfulness. He enters into our brokenness, sharing in our pain and shame. It's as if he's mind reading the mental states of every sinner, understanding our struggles from the inside out.
Wow, that's a profound way of thinking about Christ's sacrifice. It's not just about absorbing punishment, it's about a deep, empathetic identification with our humanity.
Exactly. And through this shared experience, Stump argues, we're united to Christ and therefore to God. This union, this restoration of relationship, that's what ultimately heals the sinner and brings about salvation.
So it's less about a legal transaction and more about like a profound psychological and spiritual connection. It's about being seen and understood and embraced by God in the midst of our brokenness.
You've captured the essence of it. Stump's view is just one example of how philosophers are engaging with these age-old theological ideas, offering fresh perspectives and insights that go beyond the traditional models.
It's like they're taking these ancient doctrines and putting them under a philosophical microscope, revealing new layers of meaning and complexity. The article also mentions some other models of atonement, right? Like ransom theories and divinization theories.
It does. But those haven't received as much attention from analytic philosophers. Ransom theories, which were popular in the early church, portray Christ's death as like a payment to Satan to free humanity from his grasp. Divinization, or theosis theories, on the other hand, focus on the idea that the goal of salvation is to become like God, to participate in the divine nature.
It seems like there's a whole spectrum of ways to understand how Christ's sacrifice brings about salvation.
It's amazing how much philosophical depth there is to these theological concepts. And speaking of things that deserve some serious philosophical unpacking, let's talk about sin. The article breaks it down into several categories: the first sin, the fall of Adam and Eve, original sin, and personal sin.
You're right. Each of those categories presents its own set of philosophical challenges and puzzles. Take the first sin, for example, the rebellion of Satan. How could a being created good by God choose to rebel? This gets into some really thorny questions about free will, the nature of good and evil, and whether even a perfect being could make a wrong choice.
Yeah, it's like asking, where does evil come from if everything was created good? It's a question that has haunted philosophers and theologians for ages.
Absolutely. And then there's the fall of Adam and Eve. That story raises all sorts of questions about how we understand the Genesis account, in light of what we know about evolution in human history. Right. It's hard to square a literal reading of Genesis with what science tells us about, the vast timescale of human evolution, the development of moral consciousness.
That's the challenge. Some philosophers, like Peter Van Inwagen and Hud Hudson, have tried to reconcile the traditional account of the fall with modern scientific understandings. They explore the idea that perhaps the fall wasn't a single historical event, but more like a gradual process of moral decline.
So instead of a sudden plunge into sin, it was more like a slow descent, a gradual turning away from God.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. But it's still a point of contention for many. And then we come to original sin, perhaps the most philosophically perplexing of them all. How can we be held responsible for actions committed by Adam and Eve? And how does this sinfulness get passed down through generations? Those are the million-dollar questions. There's a whole range of philosophical responses. Some thinkers, like Richard Swinburne, reject the idea that we inherit actual guilt from Adam and Eve. They see original sin more as a tendency towards sinfulness, a kind of inherited weakness or inclination toward wrongdoing, but not like a state of inherent culpability.
So we inherit the propensity for sin, but not the guilt itself.
That's Swinburne's view. But other philosophers, like Michael Ray, have tried to develop more robust accounts of original sin and inherited guilt. And this is where things get really metaphysically wild.
Bring on the wild metaphysics. I'm ready for it. How does Ray explain inherited guilt?
He draws on some pretty mind-bending ideas from metaphysics, like fission theory and the notion of temporal parts. Fission theory explores the idea of a thing splitting into like two or more distinct things. Temporal parts theory, on the other hand, suggests that objects persist through time by having different parts at different moments. It's like saying you're a collection of all your past and future selves.
Whoa, hold on. So is Ray saying that we're somehow metaphysically connected to Adam through fission or temporal parts, and that's how we inherit his guilt?
That's the gist of it. It's a very complex and controversial argument, but it highlights just how far philosophers are willing to go to try and make sense of this deeply puzzling doctrine.
It's like they're building a philosophical bridge between us and Adam, trying to establish a causal link across time and generations.
Exactly. And the article mentions another fascinating concept that comes into play here, Molinism.
Now, that's a term I've heard thrown around in philosophical circles.
Right.
And I'll be honest, I'm a bit fuzzy on the details.
Molinism is a complex theological and philosophical view about God's knowledge and human freedom. It gets into the weeds of how God knows what we'll choose to do, even though we have free will.
So it's about reconciling divine foreknowledge with human freedom.
That's the core issue. And John Mullen, a contemporary philosopher, uses a Molinist framework to argue that God could justly punish us for what we would have done in a hypothetical sinless world, even if we haven't actually committed those sins in this world.
That's a pretty mind-blowing idea.
Yeah.
So it's like God is judging us based on our potential for sin, even if we haven't actually realized that potential in this particular reality.
That's essentially the argument. It's based on the idea that God, being outside of time, has knowledge of all possible worlds and all the choices we would make in those worlds.
It's like a divine what-if scenario playing out on a cosmic scale. Okay, so we've explored the first sin, the fall, original sin, but what about personal sin? This seems like it should be the most straightforward category, the one we can most readily relate to.
You'd think so, right? But even here, there are some surprisingly complex philosophical questions. For example, how does sin relate to moral wrongdoing? Are all sins immoral actions? Are all immoral actions sins? What distinguishes a sin from a mere mistake or a lapse in judgment?
It's like we're trying to pin down the essence of sin, to understand what makes it distinct from other kinds of wrongdoing.
Exactly. These questions delve into the nature of morality, our relationship with God, and what it means to live a good life. They force us to think deeply about what it means to transgress, not just against human laws or social norms, but against God.
This is also thought-provoking. I'm starting to realize that something as seemingly straightforward as sin is actually laden with philosophical baggage.
You're absolutely right. And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. The intersection of philosophy and Christian theology is like this vast and fascinating landscape full of unexpected twists and turns. And it's a testament to the enduring power of these ancient doctrines that they continue to spark such intense philosophical debate and inquiry.
Wow, we've been on quite a journey, haven't we? Exploring like all the philosophical depths of the Trinity, the Incarnation, atonement, even sin. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, revealing more and more complexity with every layer.
It really is. It's amazing how these ancient doctrines just keep raising these super profound philosophical questions. And like in recent times, a particular approach to philosophy has really shaken things up in the theological world. I'm talking about analytic philosophy of religion.
Yeah, the article dives into that, and it sounds like analytic philosophy of religion, or APR, has been a bit of a lightning rod. Some folks think it's too theological, while others think it's not theological enough. How can that even be?
It's a fascinating tension. On the one hand, you have these critics who worry that APR is just too narrowly focused on like Christian questions. They see it as neglecting other faith perspectives and becoming this kind of exclusive philosophical club where everyone already agrees on the basics of Christianity.
So they're concerned that APR is playing favorites, prioritizing Christian ideas over others.
That's one way to put it. These critics also question whether the tools of analytic philosophy logic, argumentation, precise language are even the right tools for grappling with religious belief. They argue that faith is more about lived experience, intuition, and tradition, things that don't fit neatly into, like logical syllogisms.
It's like trying to capture the essence of a mystical experience with a mathematical equation. It seems like those critics are saying that APR is missing the heart of faith by focusing too much on the head.
That's a good way to frame it, yeah. But then you have critics coming from the opposite direction, arguing that APR isn't theological enough.
Okay, now that's really throwing me for a loop. How can something be too theological and not theological enough at the same time?
Well, these critics, many of whom are theologians themselves, claim that APR often misses the whole point of theology. They say it constructs a kind of God of the philosophers, this theoretical concept that's far removed from the God of actual religious experience and faith.
So it's like the difference between reading about love in a philosophy textbook and actually experiencing the messy, complicated reality of being in love.
That's a great analogy. These theological critics accuse APR of reducing God to, like, an object of human understanding, ignoring the mystery and transcendence that lie at the heart of faith. They even use some pretty strong language to describe what they see as the shortcomings of APR, terms like idolatry, univocity, and ontotheology.
Whoa, those terms sound pretty intense. Can you unpack them a bit for us?
Sure. Let's start with ontotheology. It's a term that goes back to the philosopher Heidegger, and it basically means treating God as just another being in the world, subject to the same categories and methods of analysis as any other object of study.
So it's like putting God under a microscope, dissecting the divine.
In a sense, yes. And this leads to the charge of univocity, which means using language in the same way when we're talking about God as when we're talking about created things. Critics argue that this approach fails to capture the radical difference between God and creation. They say we need to use analogical or metaphorical language when we speak of God, recognizing that our, finite human concepts can't fully grasp the infinite.
It's like trying to describe the vastness of the ocean using words meant for puddles. And then there's the charge of idolatry. That seems like a pretty serious accusation.
It is. Theologians who use this term, they're worried that APR, in its quest to define and analyze God, ends up creating a kind of idol, this limited human conception of God that replaces the true, unknowable God.
So the criticism is that APR, in trying to make God understandable, ends up making God too small. It's a tricky balancing act, for sure. How do analytic philosophers of religion respond to these critiques?
They have a few lines of defense. Some point out that not all APR is focused solely on Christian theology. There are analytic philosophers of religion who study other faith traditions or who approach religious questions from a more skeptical or agnostic perspective.
So it's not a monolithic field. There's diversity within APR itself.
Exactly. Others argue that even when APR does engage with specifically Christian doctrines, it's not necessarily assuming the truth of those doctrines. They're more exploring their philosophical implications. It's a kind of hypothetical exercise. If we assume, for the sake of argument, that the Trinity is true, what follows from that?
So it's a way of testing the logical coherence and implications of theological ideas without necessarily endorsing them as true.
That's one way to think about it. And then there are those, like the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who argue that Christian philosophers have every right to draw on their religious beliefs in their philosophical work. They see no need to maintain a strict separation between philosophy and theology. For them, faith can be a source of philosophical insight.
So it's a lively debate, with no easy answers. It seems like the relationship between philosophy and Christian theology is super dynamic and evolving, with different perspectives constantly challenging and enriching each other.
That's a great observation. This ongoing dialogue reminds us of the enduring power and relevance of these ancient doctrines. Even in our modern secular age, people are still grappling with these huge questions about God, faith, the meaning of life, good and evil. And philosophy, with its tools of critical thinking and rigorous analysis, it can help us navigate those questions in new and illuminating ways.
Well, listener, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored all the different ways philosophy and Christian theology can relate to one another, from integration to conflict. We delved into the philosophical puzzles surrounding the Trinity, the Incarnation, atonement, sin, and even the very nature of God. And we've seen how analytic philosophy of religion has brought new perspectives and challenges to this ongoing conversation.
It's been a whirlwind tour of some of the most profound and thought-provoking ideas in human history. And I hope it's sparked some curiosity and further exploration for you, listener.
Yeah. As we wrap up, I'm struck by the sheer depth and complexity of these topics. It's a reminder that there are no easy answers, no quick fixes to these age-old questions. But the journey of exploration, the wrestling with ideas, that back and forth between faith and reason, that's where the real richness lies.
Well said. Listener, we encourage you to keep pondering these ideas, engage in your own deep dives, and to never stop seeking understanding. Until next time, happy exploring.